Imagine if someone asked you, how do I learn about America? Well, you'd probably hand them a history book. But suppose they asked, how do I learn who the land of Israel really belongs to? Well, I'd hand them something else, a shovel. Because unlike almost anywhere else on earth, the soil of Israel has become a library. Every few inches, another century. Every excavation, another forgotten civilization. Every broken jar, another household. Another generation, another story. The late Israeli archaeologist Amnon Ben-Tor is widely associated with this striking declaration. He said, "Archaeology is our title deed to the land." Now, that's quite a statement. Some people immediately hear politics, but I hear archaeology. Because before anyone argues about the modern Middle East, the earth has already been speaking for thousands of years. Ancient walls speak, inscriptions speak, pottery speaks, the ruined cities all speak. And sometimes what they tell us is remarkably close to the world described in the Bible. So, hey, let's go digging, because you are literally standing on top of the Bible. You know, visitors to Israel often don't fully appreciate what they're seeing. Israel isn't just a country that contains archaeological sites. In a real sense, Israel is an archaeological site. Modern Jerusalem rests above Ottoman and medieval Jerusalem. And beneath that lies Byzantine and Roman Jerusalem. Beneath that lies the Jerusalem of the Second Temple period. And beneath all of that lies the city of the kings of Judah. Layer beneath layer, empire beneath empire, century beneath century. The same is true at cities like Hatzor, Megiddo, Lachish, Gezer, Bet Sha'an, Jericho. Archaeologists use the Arabic word tel for one of those ancient settlement mounds. A tel isn't really a natural hill. It's a mountain made of human habitation. One city was built. It was destroyed. Another city rose above it, and then another, and another. That's how a tel was formed. Over hundreds or even thousands of years, the ruins accumulated until human history became geography. That's why digging in Israel is never just digging through dirt. You're digging through memory. The Hebrew Bible itself understands this land in this way. The land is never just scenery. It's a witness to the covenantal drama unfolding upon it. In the book of Deuteronomy, Moses describes it as a land unlike Egypt.
For the land which you go to possess is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and watered it by foot, as a vegetable garden. But the land which you cross over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water from the rain of heaven.
This isn't abstract religious poetry. No, it's geography. Egypt depends on the Nile. The land of Israel depends on seasonal rainfall. Egypt is largely flat and irrigated. Israel is a land of ridges and valleys and springs, terraces, and unpredictable rain. The author knows the difference because the author knows the land. One reason I take the historical traditions of the Bible seriously is that its writers possess an extraordinary familiarity with the landscape. The Bible knows obscure valleys. It knows mountain passes. It knows springs and wadis. It knows which cities guard important roads. It knows the difference between hill country, the coastal plain, the Jordan Valley, the Negev, and the low country, the Shephelah, as it's called. It knows where armies could move quickly and where chariots would become useless. It knows that Jerusalem possesses a defensible ridge but suffers from limited access to water. It knows that Hatzor dominated the north, that Megiddo guarded the great international road. It knows that Jericho stood near the eastern entrance into the hill country. This is remarkably difficult to fake. And consider the biblical account of David hiding from Saul. The story doesn't just say that David went somewhere in the wilderness. It moves through a precise landscape of strongholds, caves, valleys, and settlements. Or consider the description of the border of Judah in the book of Joshua. To the modern reader, these lists can feel tedious, but to the historian, they're priceless. You see, the biblical writers aren't just inventing a fantasy country, they're describing a real one. The book of Joshua says it like this.
And the border went up by the valley of Ben Hinnom unto the side of the Jebusite southward, the same as Jerusalem. And the border went up to the top of the mountain that lies before the valley of Hinnom westward.
That is not once upon a time in a kingdom far away. It is almost a set of walking directions. The valleys are real. The ridges are real. Jerusalem is real. The geography anchors the narrative in a specific landscape. Now, geography by itself doesn't prove that every event happened exactly as it was narrated, but it does mean that traditions grew from an intimate engagement with the land. The Bible wasn't just imposed upon this landscape, it emerged from it. And this brings us to one of the greatest historical controversies of all, the Exodus. See, for generations, scholars searched for evidence of the Israelites in Egypt during the reign of Ramses II, usually in the 13th century before the Common Era. Why? Well, largely because Exodus 1:11 says that the Israelites built store cities of Pithom and Ramses, and the conclusion seemed obvious. If the city was called Ramses, the oppression must have occurred under a pharaoh named Ramses. But that conclusion may be far less secure than it first appears. Ancient writers frequently updated place names so that their readers could recognize them. Genesis speaks of Abraham traveling near Dan, although the city of Dan didn't receive that name until much later. We do the same thing today. We might say that Julius Caesar invaded France, even though the country wasn't called France in Caesar's day. So the biblical reference to Ramses doesn't necessarily date the original events to the time of Ramses II. Now, in my view, the Exodus and conquest traditions belong significantly earlier, within the world of the Middle Bronze Age, and the later Middle Kingdom and Second Intermediate Period of Egypt, as it's called. And when we look there, something extraordinary happens. The broad historical environment begins to look a lot more compatible with the biblical story. The book of Exodus begins with an Israelite population living in the eastern Nile Delta. They multiply. Their numbers alarm the Egyptian government. They become a source of forced labor. The text says this.
And the children of Israel were fruitful, and increased abundantly, and multiplied, and waxed exceeding mighty, and the land was filled with them. Now there arose a new king over Egypt, who knew not Joseph. And he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are too many and too mighty for us.
This passage presents a striking historical scenario. A large population of people from the Levant was living inside Egypt. They had once enjoyed favored status. Then, a political change transformed them into a perceived threat. They were subjected to labor for the state. For many years, skeptics just dismissed the whole picture as improbable. But archaeology has demonstrated that substantial populations from Canaan and Syria did, in fact, settle in the eastern Nile Delta of Egypt. The most important site is called Tel el Daba, identified with ancient Avaris. Ancient Avaris. Now, excavations there revealed a major Asiatic or West Semitic population. Their houses reflected Levantine architecture. Their pottery connected them with Canaan. They buried donkeys in ways paralleled in the ancient Near East. They rose to positions of considerable status. Some appear to have served the Egyptian state. Now, do we possess a tablet reading, Joseph slept here? No, not exactly. Archaeology is rarely so accommodating. Ancient people were terribly inconsiderate about labeling things for future documentaries. But the excavations prove that the central setting of the biblical tradition is historically plausible. Semitic peoples did migrate into Egypt. They did settle in the Delta. Some did prosper. And others eventually became servants and slaves. So the Bible's picture isn't just fantasy. It belongs to a recognizable historical world. The Joseph narrative is especially rich in Egyptian detail. Joseph, well, he receives an Egyptian name. He marries the daughter of an Egyptian priest. He's invested with a signet ring and fine linen. He rides in the second chariot. He oversees taxation, storage, and the royal management of grain. The story describes a highly centralized Egyptian state capable of collecting enormous agricultural surpluses. During the famine, Joseph purchases livestock and land on behalf of Pharaoh, reorganizing the whole economic system of the country. The book of Genesis says it like this.
And Joseph bought all the land of Egypt for Pharaoh, for the Egyptians sold every man his field, because the famine was sore upon them, and the land became Pharaoh's. And as for the people, he removed them city by city, from one end of the border of Egypt, even to the other end thereof.
This is one of the most politically interesting passages in the Torah. Joseph doesn't just interpret dreams. He restructures Egypt. He transforms a subsistence economy into a centralized royal system. So, in one sense, Joseph actually saves Egypt. But in another, he helps build the administrative machinery that could later be turned against his own descendants. The system that preserved the Israelites during the famine may eventually have become the system that enslaved them. That's a historical irony worthy of the Bible. And it fits particularly well within the centralized bureaucratic world of Egypt's Middle Kingdom. So why then do so many archaeologists say that evidence for the Exodus is missing? Because archaeology doesn't float freely. Everything depends upon chronology. If an archaeologist dates the Exodus to the 13th century BCE, then evidence from the 17th or 16th century is just dismissed as irrelevant. The evidence may be sitting in the ground, but it has been assigned to the wrong biblical event. And that's why the debate over Egyptian chronology matters. Scholars such as David Rohl, John Bimson, and others have challenged aspects of the conventional reconstruction. They differ among themselves, and their proposals haven't been received with universal acceptance, not by a long shot. But they have asked an essential question. What happens if the archaeological events associated with the Exodus and conquest have been placed in the wrong centuries? Just move the date, and the evidence changes. Cities, once considered destroyed too early, may suddenly fall within the relevant horizon. Settlement patterns acquire new meaning. The abandonment of Asiatic communities in the Delta becomes potentially significant. The great destruction levels at Canaanite cities can be reconsidered. Chronology isn't a minor technical issue. Chronology is the skeleton of ancient history. Put one bone in the wrong place, and the whole body looks deformed. The Exodus narrative contains, yes, theology, drama, and literary artistry. But that doesn't mean that it lacks historical memory. Ancient historical writing was never modern journalism. The Egyptians wrote history to glorify Pharaoh. The Assyrians wrote history to terrorize their enemies. The Babylonians wrote history to explain royal legitimacy. Israel wrote history to explain covenant. Every ancient people interpreted events. The presence of theology does not eliminate history. It tells us what the events meant to the people who remembered them. The famous Song of the Sea in Exodus chapter 15 is widely regarded as containing some of the oldest Hebrew poetry in the Bible. It celebrates Israel's escape from Egyptian power.
I will sing unto the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and his rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and song, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will glorify him, my Father's God, and I will exalt him.
Notice the intensity of the memory. My Father's God. This isn't presented as abstract philosophy. It's ancestral recollection. Israel's God is known through what happened to Israel's ancestors. The Exodus becomes the defining event of biblical identity. The commandments repeatedly declare, you were slaves in Egypt. You came out of Egypt. Remember what God did for you in Egypt. Could an entire people adopt such a national memory if absolutely nothing lay behind it? Possible, maybe, but unlikely. Nations glorify themselves. They rarely invent an origin story in which their ancestors were powerless slaves, rescued only through divine intervention. The Exodus tradition is profoundly unflattering to Israel. The people panic. They complain. Yes, of course, they rebel. And they build a golden calf. Moses himself never enters the promised land. Now, that's not the kind of heroic national mythology one invents to flatter one's ancestors. It bears the rough edges of remembered experience. But you see, leaving Egypt is only half the story. If these people really came out of Egypt, where did they go? And when we turn from the sands of the Nile Delta to the ruined cities of Canaan, the argument gets even more explosive. Because Jericho burned, Hatzor burned, and a new people called Israel appeared in the hills. The question isn't whether something happened. The question is whether we have dated it correctly. The Exodus isn't the end of the biblical story. It's the beginning. Because if a population really left Egypt, whether in one dramatic movement or through a more complicated series of departures, then archaeology should not only find traces in Egypt, it should find consequences in Canaan. Destroyed cities, abandoned strongholds. It should find new settlements. It should find a new identity emerging in the hills. And you know what? That's precisely where our investigation turns next. In the next episode, we'll travel from the eastern Nile Delta to Jericho, Hatzor, and the central hill country. We'll ask whether Joshua's conquest has really been disproved, or whether, once again, archaeologists have been looking in the wrong century. Because the sand of Egypt remembers the departure, but the soil of Israel remembers the arrival. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and join me as we continue exploring the places where biblical texts, ancient history, and archaeology collide.